The grandmother I remember was a kind, caring woman. She waddled with a slight hunch. Her wavy greying hair was cut to a neat bob, and she always had a tray of tea and sweets ready for us whenever we would visit. She was my mother's mother-in-law, but that didn't stop them from getting on famously. They would talk for hours and hours, while my brother and I would play in the garden. I think that they got along so well because they had a lot in common, including that they were both widows. My grandmother's husband had died in the war, while my mother's husband, my father, had died in a car accident when I was very young. I don't remember him very much at all really, so spending time around my grandma is sort of how I feel close to him. Overall, I would say I enjoyed spending time at my grandmother's house, though my brother hated it. He would always complain about having a stomachache when we got home, and I did notice that Grandma was kind of mean to him. She would scold him for behaving incorrectly, while I would only get corrected for misbehaving. It was always small things he did that set her off. For example, she insisted on smelling his hands for soap before meals, or telling him to pick up the tiniest of crumbs he dropped. In comparison, I only had to give my word that I'd washed up before eating, and if I dropped any crumbs, I was told not to worry. I never understood why she treated us differently. As a child, I thought he was just naughtier than I was. As an adult, I know better. Still, one of my fondest memories is of playing in Grandma's garden. Since she didn't seem to need money, and so didn't work that I knew of, she would have a lot of spare time to spend tending to her gardens, which of course meant that they were a kind of wonderland of lush green growth, lined with decent-sized white boulders around the rim. Her garden did have a kind of funny smell to it. I asked about it once, and found out it was the fertilizer she used. It was still gross though, a really decaying smell. Nonetheless, my brother and I would dig and play for hours in that garden. We called it the Garden of Wonders, because we would always find the funniest things in there. Watches, rings, oddly shaped rocks, sometimes even cash. As I got older, I began to understand that my grandma was probably hiding those things there for us to find, since the dirt was always disturbed, though I still played along to keep up the magic for my brother. Time passed, and we gradually stopped visiting as often. Schoolwork, college, getting jobs, it all got in the way of seeing her. So when we got the news that she had passed away, a lump of guilt sat heavily in my stomach. I regretted not visiting her more often, not spending the extra time with a person that was getting older and more frail by the day. To my surprise, however, I was notified shortly after her passing that she had left me her house in the will. A couple days later, I met the agent at her house. I signed the necessary documents, and then he handed over the keys. I wandered the hallways of that now empty house with a heavy heart. Everything was still in place, and not a single item had been moved. The place was perhaps a little dustier, but other than that, it was a snapshot from my childhood. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, down to the awful floral rug in the living room and the lacy decorative drapes. Letting nostalgia guide me, I soon found myself outside in the gardens. I walked down the path between the garden beds, and was a little upset to see that many of the plants looked dehydrated. It shouldn't have been anything unexpected, since obviously no one had touched the garden since she had died. But at such an emotional time, I equated the sad dying plants to my grandmother withering away with no one around to care for her either. That idea stirred me up into a frenzy, and I determinedly set about fixing the gardens. I was like the devil with a hand spade. I flew around watering everything, fixing the white borders back into place, and ripping out weeds mercilessly, as if they were themselves the cancer that had killed my grandmother. As I worked through each garden, I found more childhood treasures, a thick gold necklace, a man's sock, more white rocks, a smartphone. This caused me to pause. Did my grandmother really bury all these things here so that I could relive my childhood digging them up? The phone was such a recent model. It was smashed up, but it didn't make any sense to bury it. Perplexed, I put it down slowly and picked up one of the rocks and turned it over slowly in my fingers. It really was an odd shape, kind of long with bulges at either end, like a bone for a dog. As I carefully brushed the dark soil off it, an idea, a horrible idea, was formulating itself in my mind. It wasn't a rock. The treasures I had found as a child weren't random items she placed for us to find. Swallowing hard, I turned to the white boulders lining the gardens. They weren't boulders either. They were the top halves of human skulls. The rock in my hand was an arm bone. The miscellaneous items I had always found in these gardens were evidence. My mind swarmed. Had my grandfather really died at war? Was my father's car accident really an accident? What about my sweet little brother and his stomach aches after visiting Grandma? Was she poisoning him? Naturally, I called the police, and they investigated. There were 128 individual bodies found, all male, and only about a third of them could be identified. That means that out there somewhere, a family's missing a man from their lives, maybe in different states, hundreds of miles away. Maybe only a few houses over. Who knows? All I know is that my grandmother was a serial killer, and in the very gardens I had played in as a child were where her victims were buried.